Narcissists are extraordinarily skilled at managing people. But there is one development in a target's psychology that their entire system was never built to handle. The moment they realize you've become too strong, something activates in their behavior that exposes everything they spent the relationship trying to hide. There is a specific threat that developing psychological strength poses to the narcissist, one that operates at a more fundamental level than the ordinary challenges that relationships present, and that produces a response qualitatively different from the responses that ordinary conflict, ordinary disagreement, or ordinary boundary setting typically generate. It is not the threat of losing the relationship. It is the threat of losing the control architecture that the relationship was always organized to maintain. What most people don't realize is that the narcissist's investment in any relationship is not primarily emotional. It is structural. The relationship exists, from the narcissist's functional perspective, as a system that produces supply, and the production of that supply depends on specific conditions being maintained within the target psychology. Sufficient self-doubt to make gaslighting effective, sufficient fear of abandonment to make withdrawal threats credible, sufficient need for approval to make its withholding a viable control mechanism, sufficient emotional investment to ensure that manufactured crises produce the caretaking responses that supply the narcissist with both attention and evidence of their own centrality. These conditions were not accidental. They were cultivated through the systematic processes of idealization, followed by devaluation through the deliberate erosion of the target's self. Trust, through the patient construction of a relational environment in which the target's psychological resources were continuously redirected toward managing the narcissist's needs rather than sustaining their own. Pay attention to what happens to this architecture when the target's psychology genuinely shifts, because the control mechanisms were not designed to be versatile. They were calibrated precisely specifically to operate on the particular psychological profile that the narcissist spent considerable time and effort engineering. And when that profile changes, when the self-doubt decreases and the emotional resilience increases, and the fear of abandonment loses its historical power, the mechanisms don't simply become less effective. They stop working. This is where the leveraged disappearance reveals itself as the narcissist's most immediate and most disorienting experience of the target's growing strength. The toolkit that was assembled across the entire duration of the relationship, each component selected and refined based on what this specific person responded to, suddenly produces nothing. The guilt induction that reliably generated compliance produces calm acknowledgement instead. The emotional withdrawal that consistently triggered pursuit produces indifference instead. The manufactured crisis that previously activated the target's caretaking response produces a measured, boundaried reply instead. Most people miss this warning sign because the narcissist's initial response to leveraged disappearance is not panic. It is intensification, the same tactics applied with greater force, as though the problem were insufficient application rather than fundamental inapplicability. The panic comes when the intensification also fails. There is a hierarchy that exists inside the narcissist's relational world that most people never identify as a hierarchy because it never gets explicitly stated. It simply operates as the invisible organizing principle beneath every dynamic the narcissist maintains. In this hierarchy, the narcissist occupies the superior position as a fixed, unquestionable premise. Not a conclusion reached through evidence, not a position maintained through genuine demonstrated superiority. A premise assumed before the relationship began, sustained through the continuous management of the relational environment, and dependent for its maintenance on the target remaining, positioned as the less powerful party. What most people don't realize is that the target's developing strength challenges this hierarchy, not through confrontation, but through something considerably more disruptive. The behavioral demonstration that they are no longer organizing their experience of the relationship around the narcissist's position within it. They are not arguing against the hierarchy. They are simply no longer participating in its maintenance. And a hierarchy that one party has stopped maintaining cannot sustain itself on one party's effort alone. Pay attention to what this produces in the narcissist's behavior, because the threat to the hierarchy activates a response that is out of proportion to whatever specific behavior triggered it. A calm, boundaried response to a manipulation attempt produces a reaction that seems calibrated to a much more serious provocation. An instance of the target simply not seeking approval produces a response that seems designed to punish a significant betrayal. This is where the unpredictability problem compounds the hierarchy threat. Because the narcissist's tactical system depends on knowing what specific inputs will produce what specific outputs from the target. Strength makes the target behaviorally unpredictable and unpredictability in a control system that depends on accurate behavioral modeling is not merely inconvenient. Most people miss this warning sign because the disproportionate response seems like emotional reactivity. The hidden reason behind its intensity reveals something more structural. The system is encountering a target it can no longer model accurately, and a system that cannot model its target cannot control it. Fear is a behavioral signal that reveals the narcissist's panic more clearly than almost anything else in the entire dynamic. Not because it is dramatic, not because it is obviously disproportionate, but because its intensity relative to its apparent trigger is so consistently mismatched that it communicates something about the internal state driving it, that the behavior itself was not designed to reveal. The escalation arrives. What most people don't realize is that the narcissist's escalation in response to a target's developing strength is not a strategic decision. It is a panic response, the automatic output of a control system encountering resistance it was not calibrated to handle, cycling through its available tools with increasing urgency as each one fails to restore the conditions it was designed to maintain. The escalation follows a recognizable sequence. First, the existing tactics are applied with greater intensity. The same guilt induction, the same withdrawal, the same manufactured grievances, deployed with more force and less patience than before. When this produces the same ineffective results, the tactics shift, new approaches are attempted, older ones are revisited. The system cycles through its repertoire with a speed and a lack of strategic spacing that reveals the urgency driving it. Pay attention to what this escalation pattern communicates about the narcissist's internal experience, because it is the behavioral equivalent of a system running its diagnostic sequence at emergency speed. Each failed tactic is not simply a failed tactic. It is a data point confirming that the target's psychological profile has changed in ways the system's existing calibration cannot address. Most people miss this warning sign because the escalation looks like the narcissist becoming more powerful. The disproportionate reactions, the intensified manipulation attempts, the increased pressure, all of it can read as the behavior of someone who is more in control, more aggressive, more certain of their dominance. The hidden reason it is actually the opposite is visible only when you examine what the escalation is responding to. Not a threat, not a provocation, not a significant boundary violation or a dramatic confrontation. A target who simply stopped responding the way the system expected. This is where the discard threat implosion reveals the full extent of the narcissist's panic, because among all the tools in the escalating sequence, the discard threat was historically the most reliable. The implicit or explicit suggestion that the relationship could be withdrawn, that the narcissist's presence was contingent on the target's behavior, that the cost of non-compliance was the loss of the connection. This threat worked because it operated on something real, a fear, cultivated carefully across the relationship, that the narcissist's departure would represent a loss too significant to risk through non-compliance. Developing strength removes the fear. And a threat whose power was entirely borrowed from the target's fear collapses completely when that fear is no longer available to borrow from. The narcissist, deploying their most historically effective control tool, encounters for the first time the experience of watching it produce nothing. Not resistance, not negotiation, not the anxious compliance that the threat was designed to generate. Simply nothing, because the fear it was aimed at is no longer there. There is a behavioral pivot that the narcissist executes when escalation has failed to restore the previous dynamic. When the intensified tactics have produced no compliance, the discard threat has produced no fear, and the system's diagnostic sequence has cycled through its available tools without locating one that still works. The relationship resets to its beginning. What most people don't realize is that the idealization reinstatement attempt is not a genuine change in the narcissist's feelings about the target or the relationship. It is the system's recognition that the current phase of the cycle, the devaluation and control phase that the target's strength has made inoperable, needs to be bypassed in favor of an earlier phase where the target was more psychologically accessible. The warmth returns, the attention returns. The specific quality of focused regard that characterized the relationship's earliest period resurfaces with a vividness that can feel genuinely disorienting, because it arrives after a period of escalating pressure and manipulation that seemed to point in an entirely different direction. Pay attention to what this reinstatement is actually attempting to recreate, because it is not trying to restore the relationship's emotional quality for its own sake. It is trying to restore the psychological conditions that existed in the target during the idealization phase. The openness, The lowered defenses, the willingness to invest emotionally before sufficient behavioral evidence had accumulated to justify that investment. Those conditions were the ones under which the control architecture was originally installed. And the narcissist, finding that the architecture has been dismantled by the target's developing strength, is attempting to return to the moment before the installation, to recreate the psychological environment in which the installation was possible. Most people miss this warning sign because the returning warmth feels like recognition, like the narcissist finally seeing, after all the conflict and manipulation, something worth genuinely valuing. The hidden reason it arrives precisely when it does reveals its actual function. Genuine recognition doesn't emerge on a schedule determined by the failure of control tactics. What emerges on that schedule is the next tactic. This is where the smear campaign acceleration operates simultaneously, running beneath the surface of the idealization reinstatement as its contingency plan. Because while the narcissist attempts to restore the relational conditions that made control possible, they are simultaneously managing the social environment in case the restoration fails. The target's developing strength, particularly if it is accompanied by visible confidence, expanding social connections, or any form of public presence that contradicts the narcissist's existing account of them, represents a specific threat to the narrative management that is always the narcissist's parallel operational concern. A strengthened target is a target whose account of the relationship is becoming more credible to outside observers. And credibility in the hands of someone with firsthand knowledge of the narcissist's private behavior is the one thing the narcissist's social management strategy cannot afford to allow to develop unchecked. There is a discovery that awaits the narcissist when they attempt to replace a target whose developing strength has made them too difficult to control. A discovery that arrives not through any single interaction, but through the accumulating experience of a supply environment that provides more compliance but generates significantly less of a particular kind of stimulation that the strengthened target, paradoxically, had begun to produce. What most people don't realize is that a target's developing strength, while making them less controllable, simultaneously makes them more stimulating, because resistance, genuine resistance rooted in actual psychological solidity, rather than performed defiance, produces a supply experience that pure compliance never replicates. The target who pushed back from a position of genuine strength, who maintained calm in the face of escalation, who demonstrated behavioral unpredictability that the system couldn't model. That target was producing a kind of engagement that the narcissist system registered as more intense, more charged, and more activating than the easy compliance of a thoroughly conditioned supply source. The supply substitution failure arrives when new, more compliant supply reveals through its very compliance what the strengthened target's resistance was providing that compliance cannot. Pay attention to what this produces in the narcissist's behavior toward new supply. An impatience, a restlessness, an escalation that arrives faster than it did in the previous relationship because the absence of genuine resistance removes the stimulation that resistance produced. This is where the mask erosion completes the picture of the narcissist's panic. Because a target who is no longer destabilized by the persona's usual effects is a target who can observe it, not from the inside, from a slight but sufficient external distance that developing strength creates. And from that distance, something becomes visible that the destabilization was always specifically designed to prevent. The persona itself, the gap between what it presents and what the behavior behind it reveals, the specific inconsistencies that only become visible to someone who is no longer too emotionally compromised to see them clearly. Most people miss this warning sign because they don't realize how much of the narcissist persona depended on the target's destabilization to remain invisible. The hidden reason the narcissist panics when the target becomes too strong is that strength doesn't just make the target harder to control, it makes the narcissist easier to see. When you examine the complete sequence, the control architecture exposure that revealed how completely the narcissist's relational power depended on the target's vulnerability, the leverage disappearance that rendered the carefully calibrated toolkit ineffective, the hierarchy threat produced not by confrontation but by the simple behavioral withdrawal from its maintenance, the unpredictability that disabled the tactical modeling the control system depended on, the escalation that revealed panic beneath the pressure, the discard threat implosion that exposed the borrowed nature of its historical power, the idealization reinstatement that attempted to recreate the psychological conditions under which control was originally installed, the smear campaign acceleration that managed the social environment against a target whose credibility was growing, The supply substitution failure that revealed what genuine resistance had been providing, that compliance could not, and the mask erosion that made the persona visible to someone no longer destabilized enough to miss it. What becomes visible is something that the word panic only partially captures. It is a system encountering the one condition it was never designed to survive. A target who can see it clearly. What most people don't realize is that the narcissist's panic when someone becomes too strong is not about losing a person. It is about losing the conditions under which the persona was sustainable. The psychological fog of self-doubt, fear, and emotional compromise that the control architecture maintains specifically because clarity in the target was always the narcissist's greatest operational risk. Every tactic in the escalating panic sequence was designed to restore that fog. Because a target operating in clarity doesn't just resist the manipulation, they see through it completely. And what they see, once the fog has cleared, is not the confident, superior person the persona was constructed to present. It is a system running out of options that was always more dependent on their confusion than on any power of its own.